Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, joining me here today. I am trying to make sure that everything for the live stream is up and running. We've had a few technical difficulties today, so I really appreciate y'all bearing with me, as you've probably seen way too many notifications about the show today. But of course, like no new program would be without some difficulties, especially technical difficulties leading up to it, right? So with that, I will dive in. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Jalen Grisso, Matter News' co-founder and editor. Before I go any further, I want to give you all kind of a heads up about what I'm doing here, why we're going live, period, and kind of tell you what our plan is for this space that we're trying to create. I want to explain a little bit about what the thinking behind this was, and then I'll explain a little bit about the format from there. As part of our deep dive into policing and development within Columbus here, we produce a lot of in-depth articles, videos, and other multimedia content. But while working on those stories, we often hear a lot of news that informs our stories but doesn't necessarily make it to print or post-production. So we wanted to create an avenue to share those smaller bits of news that keep us and you informed. On top of that, we've also received a lot of really great feedback from you all about how much you love having this kind of live format, whether we're on the ground reporting or out at an event doing a roundtable, or a panel discussion on housing or whatever it is. We've heard from a lot of folks that it's something that you all really enjoy and find helpful and find easier to engage with the kind of information that we're providing. So this idea in the show is really a marriage of those two desires: to create live content where we can directly engage with you all, but also to make sure that we're giving you the news as we go so that you can learn right alongside us. Typically, the show will have two parts. So there will kind of be a first half that'll be what you see today, that will focus on what the biggest news that we've been seeing in development and policing is for the last few weeks. We're hoping that we can do this about twice a month, but at very minimum, we're hoping at least once a month. So the first half will be focused on kind of those news items, those headlines, kind of the biggest things that have happened recently that you need to know that might not necessarily make it into some of the bigger pieces that we do. The second half of the show will be dedicated to an interview, a live interview with a guest that has to do with either development or policing. Unfortunately, the guest that we had booked for this show was not able to make it to this one, and so we won't have a guest for this show, but in the future, that'll definitely be something you can look forward to. I'll explain a little bit more at the end, other ways that you can get this content and make sure that you're getting regular updates about the kind of things that we're talking about in the show if the live format isn't for you. So definitely stay tuned for that and make sure to pass it on to your friends who might be a little more video adverse. Okay, so I will say it might be a little bit of a blessing in disguise that we don't have a guest, because we have lots of news to talk about for the last few weeks within policing and development. So let's get to it. We're going to start off today with policing news. And as a quick note, I'll basically go in the structure that I have laid out in my super fancy whiteboard here, which actually leads me to another point that I want to mention, which is this is a very informal show, and we're kind of creating it with the idea of it being an informal show, and being something that I can just kind of come up here and say, hey guys, this is what we're learning, this is what the biggest news is right now, so that you kind of know what's going on without putting too much on us and without having to have too many bells and whistles, really just focusing on the meat of the content. Okay, so we'll start with policing news here. Earlier this week, news broke that there would be no criminal charges in the case of Ma'Khia Bryant. Ma'Khia Bryant was a 16-year-old who was shot and killed by police officer Nicholas Reardon in April 2021. Bryant was shot in Southeast Columbus, where she had been living with her foster family and her sister. As a bit of context here, this was a case that came right after the police killings of Casey Goodson Jr. and Andre Hill, a few months after that, and received a lot of attention, at very least national, if not international attention for that case. Because of potential conflict of interest, special prosecutors were assigned to investigate and present the findings to a Franklin County grand jury, which is similar to what happened in the Casey Goodson Jr. case. However, in this case, the grand jury determined that no charges were warranted because the use of force was justified, according to the decisions that the grand jury made. According to a press release from the special prosecutors, they said, quote, "Under Ohio law, the use of deadly force by a police officer is justified when there exists an immediate or imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or another. And so that's a little bit of the rationale that they gave as to why that use of force was justified. As I kind of alluded to earlier, an interesting aspect of this is that the special prosecutors assigned to this case were the same special prosecutors assigned to the Casey Goodson Jr. case. However, in that case, the grand jury did find that there were criminal charges warranted and criminal charges that were pressed against the former officer, Jason Meade. All right, for the next bit of news, we will be talking a lot about a speech that the mayor gave earlier this week. So every year, Mayor Andrew Ginther gives a State of the City address. And in that State of the City address from earlier this week, he mentioned multiple items relating to development and policing. So we'll talk about a few of those. But the very first one that I want to bring to all of you is his announcement of an allocation of $660 million to public safety for this year's operating budget. He mentioned during his speech that this is actually the largest amount that the city has ever dedicated to public safety within the city's operating budget. Those funds will include 3 new police recruiting classes that will graduate another 170 officers. As a note, while mentioning this, Ginther added that this will allow the city to, quote, bring in more officers committed to change and reform and further grow the diversity of our safety forces. A little bit of context there. The $660 million figure is about $30 million more dollars than what the previous year's safety budget was, public safety budget was. And a little more than half of that for 2021 actually went specifically to the police. If you want to find more information about what the budget for 2021 looked like for the police department and how that money was allocated, we have a really great piece by one of our reporters, Edie Driscoll, on our website under our policing tab that kind of breaks that down for you. Another SOTC piece, Ginther announced during the SOTC, that's our shorthand internally for the state of the city, so I guess I should probably mention that part. Ginther also announced during the state of the city that he's going to be expanding an alternative response program called the Right Response Unit. So this alternative response program is designed to involve social workers and mental health professionals to triage emergency calls as they come in. So essentially what that means is they mark the priority of calls as they're coming in and determine what kind of response is needed, whether that's social workers, mental health professionals, like I said, or fire, police, other emergency services. The city ran a pilot of the program last year, and they have fully marked it as a success, claiming that 60% of the calls were able to be resolved without a fire or police presence. As such, Ginther announced that there will be an expansion of the program that will include a larger staff and longer operating hours. And our last bit of news for policing for this episode, the Department of Justice has begun an investigation into Columbus police practices as part of their community-oriented policing services, according to ABC6. Ginther mentioned during his address that the DOJ would be doing this investigation, but did not mention when it was going to begin. But according to the report from ABC6, there's pretty clear evidence that they started that process this week. The DOJ will specifically be looking into community policing practices, which Ginther has said that they have done for several other police forces throughout the country. And he also mentioned during his address that this was at his request, which he submitted last spring. All right, switching gears here now. We're going to be talking a little bit about development. And while there's not quite as many headlines for the development, there's still some pretty big news. So let's talk about it. Also, during the State of the City address, Ginther announced that he plans to put a $150 million affordable housing bond before Columbus voters. That's 3 times bigger than the bond that he had passed, that he had put forth in 2019 and that voters had passed in 2019. That bond was $50 million, and in the fall of 2021, the city had announced the organizations that were going to receive that money. So they decided to allocate the full $50 million and give that money to organizations who were already creating affordable housing. Based on the estimates from the city, that $50 million will go to organizations that will be able to create more than 1,300 affordable units within the city. And those units will specifically be designated for folks who make $47,000 a year or less. Switching gears a little bit, focusing on the state level, although still local, the Ohio Tax Credit Authority approved $33 million in tax abatements to projects in Columbus and Central Ohio at large. As a reminder, for those of you who might know, tax abatements are otherwise known as tax breaks, tax cuts, things like that. Otherwise known as tax breaks, tax cuts are a different thing. are a tool that a lot of cities, states, other governments use in order to try to incentivize development. So they basically say whatever the government agency is says, you don't have to pay us this much taxes for this amount of time. And in the hopes of doing that, they'll develop areas that may not have been developed otherwise, is at least the idea. Those tax breaks were given to projects that are aimed at mixed use and developments that will specifically spur growth. This specific program was developed in 2020 for those goals, according to Columbus Business First. In Columbus alone, 28 million of that, those dollars will be, in Columbus alone, $28 million in tax breaks were approved of that 33 million. 14 million of that is for Gravity 2, and 7 million is for Cover My Meds. Both of those developments are in the Franklinton neighborhood. An additional 5 million was approved for renovation projects in Delaware and Newark. For both of those projects, they are historic properties that I believe both of them are over 100 years old, that are going to be renovated and kind of retrofitted. Okay, and then the very last bit of news for development. Our last bit of news for today is that developers broke ground earlier this month on a Topiary Park development downtown. So this development will be right across the street from the Topiary Park in that downtown neighborhood. The development is the first of its type. It's the first affordable housing development of its type to come from the Columbus Downtown Development Corporation. That corporation is a nonprofit development group responsible for the Scioto Mile as well as Columbus Commons and several other projects downtown. This specific project will include, is anticipated to include almost 100 units that will all be marked for different income levels. Half of those units will be dedicated to folks making $55,000 or less per year, and the remaining half will be evenly split between folks making $45,000 per year and $35,000 per year. And those income brackets are according to Columbus Business First. Alrighty, folks, and that is all of the news that I have for you today. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and I really appreciate bearing with us as we kind of get our bearings here. As always, I always appreciate any feedback on the format or function of this. If you think my handwriting needs to be cleaner, or if there's any other suggestions that you have about how we could potentially improve the show and what kind of content you like and what kind of content you'd like to see, please feel free to reach out. For anyone that's tuned in later into the show, you'll be able to find the entire thing on most of our social media platforms. The format might look a little bit different on Instagram compared to some of the other platforms, but all of the content will be there. But as I mentioned earlier, we also will have text versions of those available for folks who may prefer that. I can kind of be one of those folks sometimes. So we'll take this bit of the show, which is like focusing on breaking or news that's more relevant and recent, right? And we'll produce a written digest of these headlines and these bits of news that we'll send out in both an email format and we'll publish it to our website. And then when we have guests, we'll also take that content and turn it into a Q&A that will be in a written format that will be available for folks to consume in that way as well, and also sent out via email and posted onto the website. So if you are the kind of person who would rather see it in writing, definitely feel free to check out our website in the next few days. Or if you want it sent directly to your inbox, you can sign up for our email newsletter, you can sign up for our email list by going to matternews.org/newsletter. Thanks again for joining me. As always, if you need to reach out to us for any reason, story idea, complaint, whatever you got, you can always email us at editorial@matternews.org. Thank you so much, and we'll be back in a few weeks with some more news and a guest, and we will see you then. Have a good night.